Morning, everyone. I'm so glad to see everyone show up like the second day after all the Disneying and everything. Everyone in this room, the reason why we show up this morning is because we all want to be better at design. Like, even if design isn't your main job, if you're not like, your job title isn't designer, if you can make better design decisions, you're going to feel pretty darn cool. And being able to understand like the way we can use animation and the benefits animation can give us can make us be better designers. You know, understanding animation well can help us make the things we make easier to use, make them look better, and just generally be a more interesting and better experience. And I think that we should use animation more in our work, but sometimes that's not the most popular opinion. Some people think that's a really terrible idea, and they're like, "You want to see more animation on the web? No." And things like the whole banner ad scene, the whole skip intro era, all of those things have kind of given animation on the web a bad reputation, right? Like there's just sort of like a sketchy past there. So a lot of the times when I say I think we should use animation more on the web, people who think that's a terrible idea tend to think that more animation on the web means we'll end up with an entire internet of sites like this. This is a video, and it's a little hard to know what I'm doing, but I'm trying to scroll down to read some content. Effective, yes? It's not done yet, and then when it is done, you get to see it all backwards when you scroll back to the top to be like, what? What just happened? And like, using animation more on the web could mean an entire internet of this. If we all decide to go home on like Thursday or Friday and are like, everyone, spin the paragraphs. If we all do that, this could be what the internet looks like. But don't do that, please. But more animation on the web can also mean seeing more products and sites like this. And this is Stripe Checkout. If you've ever like re-upped your Dribble account or used their sample donation form or anything before, you might have encountered their checkout flow. And their entire checkout process has a ton of animation. Basically, almost every single interaction, every single thing you click or touch in this flow has some kind of animation attached to it or triggers some kind of animation. And the difference between the way the Stripe checkout works and all of their animation and how that feels like a thing you don't even notice until someone like me points it out. You can go through and check out with Stripe and never even think about like, oh, all of that was animating. It wasn't so, in your face. And the difference between Stripe's animations and Stripe's site and the GoChat animations isn't the number of animations, it's the way they're designed. The Stripe animations, they designed them for us, the people using this thing. They thought about what would be useful for us, what we would actually, what we would be paying attention to, what we would need to do. And then they also made these animations fit with the rest of the design. They kind of have the same feel and tone as the rest of like the color choices and type choices. It's all very clean and smooth and sophisticated feeling. GoChat, on the other hand, the meeting that came out of was probably like, did you know we can rotate things in CSS? And like they didn't care about what it was going to be like to use or read, because you kind of can't. But that's the difference there, is the intention and the design, not the number of animations. I mean, they may have the same number of animations. I've never actually counted them. But if we want to create animations more like Stripe and make that be the more animation on the web, the key to that for us is to combine this purpose and style together, exactly how Stripe has done. They're like, we're going to make animations, make this easier to use. We're going to think about what our users are doing and how we can make their life easier and how we can make this also look good at the same time. So they know why their animations are there, and they made them look really good. So today I'm going to talk a lot about animating with style, because I think in a lot of the cases that can be the harder thing to do. Very few of us have backgrounds in motion design or traditional animation. So the idea of like looking at animation and evaluating it and deciding like, does this look good, can be a really hard thing, because you're like, I don't know, and then your teammate's like, I don't know either. I guess it's okay. Like we can do a little better than that. So I'm going to focus on animating with style today. So a lot of the time, if we go to design something with like type or color or something like that, we'll go and look at some general principles of like typography or some like color theory to kind of maybe base our decisions off of. Like we have this reference point for like, are we doing good things with type? If we wanted to make a really beautiful type layout, we might go look at some rules around like leading and spacing and X heights and readability and all those things. And by paying attention to those general typography principles, we could come up with a really good type layout. And we're like, yeah, that worked out well. If we ignored a lot of those principles, maybe our type layout wouldn't look so great. But we tend not to do that at all with animation. We just kind of were like, oh, I guess it's good. But there's some principles we can use to inform our work with animation as well, to help us decide, like, have we made this say the appropriate things? How do we say the appropriate things? That kind of thing. So those principles that kind of guide our decisions, or can guide our decisions with animation, are called the classic principles of animation. And the sort of key 12 principles of animation that came about many decades ago were put together by a little company called Disney, who you may have heard of. If you are here right now and you haven't heard of them, we should talk. So, Disney put together this book called The Illusions of Life, and this book was basically the story of how they changed the entire industry of animation. When Disney came on the scene of animation, I guess in like the late 20s, 30s-ish kind of time, animation was basically just kind of like a technical feat. People were like, hey, did you see I could make this stuff move by playing this film strip really fast in front of some light? And then audiences were like, wow, we've never seen that before. So it was very much based on just like the technical execution. Then Disney and his animators came along and they were like, hey, what if we use this medium to like tell a story? What if we tried to make this look like it was real and happening in real life? And that changed everything, because they created things like, all of their characters, all of their stories, and then many years later, they packaged it all up in this book called The Illusion of Life and revealed how it was they made things look like they were alive, when we all know they were just, drawn on 2D cell drawings going by very quickly. So the key parts of The Illusions of Life, it's a really thick book, but there's one section called The 12 Principles of Animation, and that's where where we pull a lot of these sort of like guidelines for what makes good animation from. They're also nicely summarized in this Tumblr, so if you're like not into books or like reading long pages, Tumblr, it has GIFs too, so you're all set. No cats though, this is one Tumblr with no cats, I'm sorry. Yeah, disappointing, but it's good information. So, Disney went, and the reason they put these together is like this is how they taught their animators to make good animation, and they revealed it all in this story, in this book rather, to tell everyone how it was they got this done. And then these 12 principles sometimes get mentioned in articles about UX and such. A lot of the time they're just like, and there's 12 principles. Okay, next thing, they're not often delved into with too much detail. And a lot of the time they're presented as kind of this checklist of things that you need to do. But really they're more like 12 related concepts that we can pull from as we need to make better animation decisions. So this is the actual page in the book, in case you didn't believe me, there was 12. They're right there. And I find that, we can pull from these and this history of animation to make better animation decisions when we're animating interfaces. In particular, I've picked out 3 of them that I think can make the biggest impact on the kind of work we do, because these were written for a different medium and a different time, but there's a lot that we can learn from them. So I've put together a little example for us to show you how we can apply just 3 of these 12 to make a really big difference on a basic animation that we might see on the web. So our basic little demo here is something that happens a lot in interfaces. It's just a modal entering the screen. And it's really at the point where it's just like someone was like, oh, I think this should transition onto the screen. And then they were like, transition, go, and then you get this. Right? It transitions onto the screen in slow motion, right? Because everything's better in slow motion. So this particular modal is confirming our reservation at a cat cafe. Since the Tumblr didn't have cats, I used some cats, so we're all okay. And it's really just at the point where they were like, okay, it comes onto screen, good, done. But I don't think it's done. I think we can do better than this by applying some of these principles of animation and just make it more designed, more intentional, and beyond just the like, okay, it moves. So to show you what's going on under the hood in this particular little modal guy, we have this section that has 2 animations applied to it. That's our little modal box. Tried to keep it super simple. I figure if we can make a difference on a really simple animation, imagine what you can do with a complex one. Worlds will change. So we have 2 animations. It's sliding in. Crazy naming structure there. And it also fades in at the beginning. So we have a long slide in and a tiny fade in that happens at the beginning of that action. The keyframes that run our slide-in animation just basically tell it to go from a position that's like kind of rotated down and like 400 pixels lower than it would be to where it would normally be. Pretty exciting. And then our fade-in animation does exactly what you would think it might do, where it goes from an opacity of 0 to opacity of 1 and basically is like, hello, I'm here. So that's what we have running this behind the scenes. And if you're looking at this and you're like, hey, we could do this as transitions, you are right, but we're not. We're doing it with keyframes today. So let's look at 3 principles of animation that can make this modal better, make it more interesting, make it like actually a thing we thought about and didn't just like check off a list. So the first principle I want to talk about is the principle of timing and spacing, sometimes also called just timing for short because 2 words is too long. Who knows? But timing is one of those principles that, like, if there was only ever one principle of animation you ever bothered to care about or pay attention to at all, the one that you should pay attention to is timing. It really is the key to animation. And if you can have a good sense of timing as a designer, you can create animation that's just going to look and feel really good, because this is kind of like the backbone of all 12 principles. So timing is technically the amount of time it takes for something to happen. It's like, how fast does it go? How long does it take to do the thing we've asked it to do? It's essentially timing. The traditional way of explaining timing, or of demonstrating timing, is with a bouncing ball. And I figured if that's good enough for all of these animation textbooks, it's totally good enough for me. So I made you a bouncing ball animation. Yeah, I didn't think you were going to see that today, did you? Yeah, it's like the hello world of animation, right? A bouncing ball. And in case you've forgotten what that looks like, it looks like that. Pretty simple. Got our nice little bouncing ball. So let's look at the timing of this ball. If we wanted to mark the timing of this ball in that particular animation, we would basically mark each action as it took place. So marking the timing of this bouncing ball would look like this. So we have that kind of like dun, 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 and that's our timing of the ball. We get a little bit of information about the ball just from that timing, right? Like the last 2 bounces happen closer together, so clearly it's like losing some speed and momentum, and it's having to fall faster because it doesn't have enough to push itself forward. Also, the fact that it actually hits the ground 4 times means it's probably pretty light. Like if it was a bowling ball, our animation would just be like thunk, and that would be it. So clearly this is lighter than a bowling ball, probably smaller than a bowling ball, and we can get all that just from the timing. So the other half of this principle, the other part of timing, is spacing. And spacing quite literally fills in the gaps of timing. However long something took, it's going to probably change speed over the course of that timing. And spacing is what that is. It's basically how things change speed over the course of their action, and it's filling in all of those gaps. So if we go back to our bouncing ball and fill in the spacing, to reveal the spacing rather, the way we'd want to show that is to take a little freeze frame of the ball at each frame of the action. And the idea being that if frame rate is constant, you can see the different amounts it's moved with each frame. So if we did that with our ball, took a little freeze frame at each frame of the animation, we get something like this. So that's the spacing of our ball. And you'll notice, like at the very beginning where it's falling very quickly down, the frames are spaced out further. So at a constant frame rate, it's going faster because it's covering more ground in that small amount of time. Then as it hits the ground, it goes back up, it gets to those arcs, and it's like, oh, gravity, this kind of sucks. It slows down and then eventually gets pulled back down to the ground and being faster again. But at the top of those arcs is going just a little bit slower as it's fighting all the forces of gravity and stuff. Even though we know this is just a pink circle on screen and there really is no gravity, but we can fake it. We can create that sense of gravity and stuff. So we can get even more information about the ball here by how much it kind of speeds up and slows down. It's going pretty fast on the way down. Maybe someone was actually like throwing it. Maybe it had some force behind it. It didn't just like roll off a table. And the fact that when it hits the ground, it's still a very perfect circle gives us a sense that like it's probably very rigid. Like maybe this is like a golf ball or a ping pong ball. And we can get all that just from the kind of timing and spacing that we choose for this particular ball animation. It may not be the most amazing bouncing ball you've ever seen, but we can gather a lot of information from the timing and spacing that are used. So the reasons that timing and spacing are so important is they can make animated objects appear to obey the law of physics. And it's really just an appearance, right? Like, to make that bouncing ball animation, I did not like model some physics engine and like do some crazy box 3D stuff or anything. I just kind of, did it frame by frame. So there's a lot we can do when we consider these principles to just like fake physics, kind of create the illusion of it or the suggestion of it and make things just feel that more natural and real. And it's also, these two things are really good at establishing the mood and emotion of an object, which may seem kind of crazy, but it's really it's really the part that I think applies more to us when we're dealing with interfaces. You can make a button that like moves in an angry way, one that moves in a happy way, and people using your interface will really actually get that. There's this really kind of amazing study that happened many years ago that really illustrates this well, where the researchers showed a group of students just an animation of not random shapes, but just basic shapes. And this is just a little segment of it. And they asked the students to, write a description of what they saw. And the students would write things like, that one triangle was really mean, so mean, such a jerk. And that circle was so scared. And like they'd project all of these emotional states and like personality traits onto these shapes. And there was no story there. These were just like kind of random movements. These weren't characters. They didn't have like arms and legs and faces. They're just basic shapes. But yet we project this emotional kind of state and this personality on them. And that's what happens a lot in interfaces too. When we're dealing with a lot of basic shapes, the way we move them around suggests things about both their own personality and the personality of the entire application. So timing and spacing are super important. They can fake physics, they can create emotional states and communicate all these things about your motion. For most of the things we use, CSS, JavaScript, all those things, timing is duration, spacing is easing. And then you might be thinking, I've animated some stuff in CSS. I've only noticed like 5 easing options, so this is not a very expressive medium, is it? Which, you're like, 5 ways I can do my spacing and cause personality and physics to happen. And if you want to be really picky, which I do, because why not? Linear doesn't count. It's just a constant rate of motion across an entire movement. Nothing in the real physical world can do that. I mean, that might be a good challenge at lunch if you want to try to like walk somewhere without speeding up or slowing down. Just don't be near a wall or anything. Totally impossible. So that's why we have things like the cubic Bezier function. Like this is the key to creating really expressive animation in CSS. And even in things like JavaScript, like just about every JavaScript library has some keywords for easing, some defaults for easing, and then also has some function, whether it's cubic Beziers or springs or something else, to really be expressive and like dig in and create your own custom easing. So the cubic Bezier function may not be something that you totally love. It may not be your friend yet. By the end of today, it totally will be. But I know when I first saw cubic Bezier functions, I was like, what is that number bar doing in my CSS? Like, seriously. No one talks about motion like this. No one is like, okay, you know what we need here? I think it's more like a 0.430. Yeah, that'll fix it. Like nobody does that. No one thinks of motion like this. Motion is a very visual thing, and this is a list of 4 numbers. The nice thing is we can look at these cubic Bezier functions in a completely different way besides a list of numbers. Those 4 numbers are 2 xy coordinates, and if you're super into graphs, you probably already saw that. You're like, yeah, 2 xy coordinates, yes. That's what people who like graphs do. They're like, yes, graphing. I don't know, I think graphs are pretty cool. We can take those 2 xy coordinates and plot them on a motion graph like this. So this is a basic motion graph. It plots the progression of our animation against time, and there are 2 fixed points in this graph. The first one is the start. Your animation does have to start. It just has to, regardless of philosophical whatevers, it has to start. The other fixed point is the end, where it also has to end. So it starts and it ends, and those are fixed. But the pieces we can move are those 2 smaller circles, and those are our 2 xy coordinates. Depending on the position of those little control handles, a lot like how when we draw vectors in like Illustrator or Sketch or something like that, we can affect the shape of the curve between those 2 points. So even though they have to start and finish, we can make that curve be many, many different shapes, almost infinite options there of how we can make that curve work. And the really great thing about these graphs is they're super easy to read at a glance, because where it's steepest, the rate of change is fastest, and where they're flatter, the rate of change is slower. So this graph is illustrating some easing that would be like slow, fast, slow. Conveniently a type of ease in out. Who knew? So for these cubic Beziers, once we start adjusting these handles on some place like cubicbezier.com, or in a variety of code editors have little cubic Bezier editors now. Even browsers have cubic Bezier editors now. They're everywhere. It's the best. You can adjust these little handles, make the curve be anything you want, and then in the case of cubicbezier.com, you can also race one curve against the other. Pretty exciting, right? I know. It's a lot to take in first thing in the morning. Racing, easing curves. Whew. Oh my goodness. And look at, I have like 4 more I can erase at the bottom. This could go on all day. Don't worry, it won't. So the moral of the story is that everything is better with cubic Beziers. Everything, ice cream, Disney, pizza, but especially CSS animation and any kind of web animation. When we create and take the time to actually create these custom curves and go away from these defaults, we create motion that has a different feel and a different expression. So, to apply timing and spacing to our example, which hopefully you haven't forgotten about after that little rant about cubic Beziers. To apply this concept of timing and spacing to our example, we want to think of 2 things. We want to think of, okay, so what kind of physical traits do we want our modal to have? And what sort of mood or emotion should it show? So the first one's pretty easy. I think it should feel pretty light and smooth. Like, it shouldn't be like a modal that you're like, oh, come on, modal, please show. Like, it should just be like, whoop. It should have a very, like, kind of low friction sort of movement. It should just be, like, going. And the mood or emotion it should show should really fit the context of what's happening, right? Like, our demo had some really bright colors. We've got some bright oranges. We've got a cat in a teacup. We have just completed a whole sequence to make a reservation. This should be like an exciting time. And if nothing else, we're going to go hang out with some cats, so that's pretty awesome. So I feel like it should have some high energy and kind of happiness to it. And if you remember at the beginning, when it just kind of entered, its expression was just sort of like, here's your reservation. That's basically what it said. It was just like, okay. Which, might be grumpy cat style, but not really giving us the effect we want. So, in true cooking show style, I decided that I would pick a custom cubic Bezier function, a custom easing for us to use to give our modal a little bit more energy and to feel like it was a little lighter and was a bit more of having that like excited emotional feel. So the cubic Bezier function I picked is this one. There's the graph there, and you can also see the cubic Bezier numbers as well in both expressions. And obviously, these take a little bit of time to actually pick. You don't just like go to cubicbezier.com and make the first one, that's the perfect one. But it's really boring to watch someone fiddle with curves, so I just picked one ahead of time. And this particular curve, it's going to go pretty quick because it starts out pretty steep, and then just kind of slow down at the end. So it should be a high energy thing of like, yeah, there we go. So to use this cubic Bezier function in our CSS, we just go back to that source CSS, and we put it right there in the bright green highlighting. So we just took out the ease out, put in our cubic Bezier function, and then once we do that, our modal now looks like this. Are you ready for the big difference? Yeah. It's a little happier. It's like, here's your reservation. Oh, slow motion. I forgot about the slow motion. It's always, in slow motion, it's like, here's your reservation. But it's still happier. It's got that like quicker, launch. It seems to have this energy, and then it's got so much energy it overshoots its destination and like kind of bounces back in place. It feels much more energetic. Feels like it's more excited. Has a more exciting feel to it, and also feels like it's going faster. Right? All we did was change the easing, and it seems like it went faster, but we didn't change the timing at all. So conveniently, by adjusting our timing and spacing in this way, by creating this cubic Bezier function that would actually have our modal like overshoot its destination and settle back in place, we got one more classic principle out of it. Pretty cool, huh? 2 for 1. By choosing that cubic Bezier and creating that overshooting motion, we got the principle of follow through as well. So this is kind of how these principles go together and aren't just like a list of 12 discrete things. Depending on your timing and spacing choices, you may also hit on other principles as well. So follow through is the idea that basically not everything stops at once. And it's one of those things that, like, when you read about it, you're like, oh yeah, not everything stops at once. Like, if you think about yourself, when you're like walking, you're moving your arms, like you never like stop dead. Like your arms slow down and stop after the rest of your body does. If you have like long hair or like a cape, I don't know, is anyone wearing a cape today? Or some other flowy wardrobe option, like it's gonna stop after you do. The kind of really, the classic example that's in like all the animation textbooks, and I really love this one, it's of a bulldog with his droopy cheeks, right? If a cute little bulldog with his droopy jowls turns his head, his cheeks are like always behind, so he's like, thump, and his cheeks are like blub, 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 and then they stop, and he goes this way, and they're like da, 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 and then they stop, and they're always just a little behind. Same with floppy ears and all that kind of stuff. So follow through can be very squishy in that sense. And follow through can also be very rigid, though. It's like any amount of things not stopping at the same time or not stopping at once. So even like Roadrunner stopping for birdseed has some follow through as well. But he's much more like, oh, bird seed, not like the dog who's like blah, blah, blah. So very different kinds of follow through. And for us, when we're not necessarily, animating things that have tails and feathers or droopy cheeks or capes, don't come up in interfaces all that often. For us, follow through often kind of manifests itself in the sense of overshooting that target position. And it's the same idea, right? It's like having that extra energy that just can't be stopped all at once. It's like you're overshooting your destination in the terms of our modal, or just the idea of being like, whoa, all right. It gives that kind of sense of energetic feel. So the easiest way to get follow through is to choose a cubic Bezier function that shoots out outside of the graph area by like jutting out there on top is how we got that. The second easiest way is to add keyframes that actually go past your action and then back to its final resting position. But I decided to take the easy way and use this curve. So that's how we got some follow through there as well. So awesome, we've covered 2 principles of animation. We thought about our timing, and by the timing and spacing we chose, we got some follow through in there. We're creating this better sense of energy, but I think we could do just one more better. And also I said we were going to use 3, so I kind of have to come up with a third one. Sort of how it goes. So the third one I want to add in is the idea of secondary action. And this one is a little bit less straightforward in the sense that it's takes a little bit more thought of figuring out where a good place for secondary action might be. So secondary action is defined as basically any action that reinforces the main action, which is kind of like just restating the word secondary action, if you think about it. I'm not sure about their official definition. It could probably use a bit more description, but it makes a lot of sense. You're like anything that enhances the main action, anything that makes it seem like a bigger deal, draws more attention to it, makes it seem more important, that's secondary action. So a way we see this a lot is in very like illustrated animations, animation that's very illustrated. We see it a lot if you've ever liked a tweet. That probably happens a lot, right? So you like a tweet in case you haven't in a while, does this. So the main action of this like animation is the heart scaling up and back, right? That's the main action. But the secondary action are all those little dots and the circles flying out that are like, yay, heart. And if it was just the heart scaling up and back, I mean, that would be kind of cool. But all of those little dots and little things flying around just make it so much more dramatic and make it more of like an event that you've liked this tweet. And right below here we have the sprite that Twitter uses to create that animation. This is like each frame of the like heart animation one by one. And I don't know if you ever noticed that it starts as a pink circle. Doesn't even start as a heart. Who knew? So the way they did this is they have like just a little kind of visible window area, and they just like slide that image, that big long image, past it to create the animation. It's like almost very old school, right? The sprite animation. So this kind of secondary action of having little dots and circles coming out, having these little bits and bobs flying around, probably isn't going to work very well for our modal. Like, I mean, it'd be sort of cool if like the modal came up and like fireworks exploded out of it. But I feel like that might be a little over the top and like not fitting at all with the design or the context or like good taste in general. So I've thought of a different way we can add some secondary action as well. Right now we have our modal kind of all coming up in one piece, right? Like it has the title, the paragraph, it has this little bit about your ticket, it has a little cat, and it all comes up as like one thing as if it's all etched in glass. So what if we let those separate out a little bit and created kind of a more like wave-like motion, like allowed some of those child elements to move at a different pace than their parent? And having like the title and the paragraph come up together, have everything meet at the top, and then kind of settle down. So I'm thinking of creating some secondary action by separating those out, being like title, paragraph, everyone settle, yay, and creating a little bit more of an organic wave to things. So to add in some secondary action, I've also made the possibly questionable choice of doing live coding this demo. So yeah, who knows if that's a good idea? We'll find out in a second. This is always a scary part of the talk. So let me show you what I've got working on. So just to prove that this is the same cat and the same modal, if we refresh him here, that's right where we left off, right? He's got his little like follow through going on. He's like, yeah, reservation. We're gonna make it just feel a little bit more lifelike, a little bit more organic feeling than that kind of stiff entrance and exit. So this is our CSS with our cubic Bezier. You can tell it's the same one because it highlights in green. That's how it works, right? Oh boy. So to make this happen, to create this sense of, the kind of child elements being pulled up behind the parent, I'm going to make a second animation, a second set of keyframes for the child elements that's shorter. So the parent's kind of going from like way down here to way up here, and I'll make one that's like from down here to up here for the children element, so they can feel like they're being pulled up behind. And obviously, if they don't need to cover quite as much ground, because they're already being pulled up by the parent as well. There's kind of two forces acting on them. So to create this second animation, I'll just create a second set of keyframes. I'll call it slide in short because I am very creative with my animation names, and it's a short version of slide in case you're wondering. We'll make it go from a transform of a rotation, since our parent goes from a rotation down to and starts at a position that's rotated and lowered. So we'll do the same thing. We'll do a rotation on the x-axis as well. We'll make it smaller, like 15 degrees. That's not 15, but this is. And then we'll also translate it down a little bit on the y-axis. The parent's down like 400 pixels, so maybe we'll do like 60. That sounds like a good number. And then we'll go to a transform again of a rotation, also on the x-axis, and we'll do that as being 0. So basically like where you would normally be, no rotation. Don't change yourself at all for us, modal, not at the end. And then we'll translate on the y-axis of 0 as well. So it's going from like a little bit rotated forward, a little bit down, to exactly where it would normally be. And apparently it does a jazz hands thing when that happens. I don't know. That's how all of the elements move in my interfaces, jazz hands all around. So once we have those keyframes in place, we want to apply them to the actual child elements. And I'm thinking of applying them to the ticket info and to the text. So we can have like text, ticket info, everyone together, yay! Kind of thing. So to apply it to the text first, I'm going to apply it to the H2 and the paragraph. I wrote the HTML, so I know that's what they are. And we'll apply an animation to them. The one we'll apply is the slide in short, because we just wrote it, and it would be really silly to apply an animation other than the one I just wrote, at least in this particular case. We'll make this particular animation, we'll make it take 0.3 seconds. So it's significantly shorter than its parent. The parent one I think is like 0.7 seconds. This is going to be a little less than half. And we're going to delay it by 0.15 seconds. So when this one starts moving, the parent will have already brought it partway up, and then it will continue itself. And then we'll give it the easing of ease out, which is a Sass variable that I've set to be a custom cubic Bezier function. Figured I could like show off and show you that I can make variables in case everything else goes horribly wrong. It didn't really work, I guess. That's okay. Like, not impressed with variables. All right, I'll just try to do the CSS correctly. So then we also want to make it fade in, because our parent element did the slide in and the fade in. So to make that match, because it would seem really weird if the parent kind of has this soft appearance and then the child's just like, hey, like we want to have that fade in too. So we'll give it the fade in. That'll take 0.15 seconds, and we'll also delay it by 0.15 seconds. So that way both animations applied to this child element start at the same time. It'd be a little awkward if they don't. We'll give this one the ease in. We'll even spell ease correctly. I hear that's awesome. And yeah, so we'll just apply those two, much like its parent had. Slightly different animation, slightly different timing, and that paired delay. So that'll be our first set, our paragraph and our title. But we also want to have the ticket info coming up as well. So to do that, I will give our ticket info. Same kind of animation. We'll give it the slide in short as well. We'll make it take 0.3 seconds too, because it would kind of make sense that if they're both having the same movement, they should probably take the same length of time. But we'll delay it by just a little bit more, by 1/10 of a second. So it'll be delayed by 0.25 seconds. So we'll have paragraph and title, then ticket info. Yay! And the delays is what creates that stagger. We'll make them ease out, a fill mode of both, just like its friend. And then we'll also fade this in for the same reasons we did the first one. So 0.15 seconds. For the duration, delay it by 2.5 seconds. So these start at the same time. And then use our fancy custom ease in, because why not? And the fill mode in both. So, assuming I have not made any obnoxious mistakes, we can save that and then go back to our modal. And we'll make this bigger so it's like nice and obvious. It's looking a little bit better. Should we see it in slow motion? No one ever says no to that. It's great. So we can do that, and then we can play that back in slow motion. So we have, as the parent comes up, we have child, child, and everything comes down together. And that really accentuates that upward movement and that sense of energy of like hitting that top, kind of makes it seem like more like it hit something as opposed to just kind of flopping over. And also, it's a little bit cut off because of our inspector here, but creating that heightened upward movement makes your eye follow downward to the button more easily as well. So we've created this more organic feel to our modal. We really haven't changed anything about like how long it takes. It's still just as fast, but we actually actually designed it to make it feel a little bit more energetic, to make it feel more organic and less of like kind of a flat, just there sort of thing. So I think we did a pretty good job on that. So just those few little things that we thought about, of just giving some thought to its timing and spacing, giving some thought to what energy it should have, we've created a modal that is looking a whole lot better and fits the design much better than our original just kind of it moves sort of situation. So not too bad for a few minutes of work, really. I mean, it goes much faster when you're not on stage too. We did it in like a few minutes, but if you're just doing it at your desk, you can do this in like 5 seconds. So it's pretty nice. I think when you consider animation in the same way that you consider things like type and color, we can just come up with so much more effective ways of getting it there on screen. So that's all looking at one particular animation, right? Like we spent some time thinking about like what kind of energy should that one animation have? What sort of, physical sense should it have? All great to do, but chances are anything you're working on is probably going to have more than one animation. It would be a lot of work to just put in one and not do any other things. So I'm going to take a step back and look at step up and look at the bigger picture. How do we create or how do we work with many animations at once? We put in a lot of thought to that modal entrance. And once we've done that, we probably want any other animations in our site, in our application, to have some similar sense to them, to feel like they're related, right? Like if this one comes in with a very energetic feel, we don't want everything else to be back to what that one was originally, where it was just like, reservation. So when you're thinking about all the animations in your site or in your app as kind of like that bigger picture, that group, you get to think about things like choreography, which is sort of like a really fancy way of being like, how do we deal with more than one of these? So in the sense of, choreography comes from the idea of like dance and theater, but on the sense of, for interfaces, it's really more about, making sure there's a common thread through all the animations you use. So you don't end up with like 50 different fade-ins, because that would be weird and awkward. You could have just like this common thread throughout them all, making them feel like they're coming from the same place, like they're related. So a couple of tips for choreography that make things work pretty well is to have similar objects move in similar ways. And we saw that just now with our little title and our ticket info, those two things of text. They were both child elements. They were both giving you details about your reservation. So we made them move in the same way. We didn't have to, but it was kind of a logical way to do it. If we have thumbnails that enter like this, it's very obvious they're all the same thing. They're just kind of like bloop, 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 and there they go. They're a little offset, but they're using the exact same motion to get in there. If all of your thumbnails appeared more like this, you're like, wait, why did that one flip up? Are they not the same? Are they the same? Like it just gives you that second of hesitation, not to mention it's visually a lot more difficult to follow. That like straightforward, like doop, doop, doop is really easy to see. That kind of flippy up-down thing, you're like, what is happening? So having those similar objects reinforces that they are similar when they move in similar ways. Another really good sense of choreography can come from having your entrances inform exits. If you think of these objects as things that can have personalities and have physical traits, it becomes easier to also think of them as being like, having a place to be or places to go in kind of a logical way. So a very logical way of having entrances inform exits is to have a modal come up from the bottom and then also return to the bottom. And that gives you the sense of like, modals live down there. If I need a modal, it's going to come up from the top and then it'll go back down because that's where they live. That's modal land. It has that really logical, balanced feel. Now, it's not to say that, your modals and everything always have to go to exactly where they were before, but there's a grounding sense of it returning to where it came from. And if you don't have a really good reason for doing something different, that's a good default to use. So for example, if that same modal was coming up from the bottom, and then like you didn't do anything different, but it just goes off to the right, you're like, what? Like, why? Did I do something? If there wasn't any actual action taking place, that can be very confusing. If you have something that's like, you can have them be more complex too, of like, oh, the modal goes up, Comes from the bottom, it goes back down if you cancel it, or it goes to the top if you confirm things. Having some logical flow, not just a random movement, it helps in the choreography as well. And then once your modals enter that way, anything else can enter that way as well. So you have this kind of set rule, kind of like creating the rules of the universe of your site sort of thing. One of the harder ones, but the more effective ones, is to match velocities instead of matching durations. So most of the things we use for animation on the web, definitely CSS, many JavaScript libraries, they really focus on the duration of animation, right? You're telling the thing where to go, and you tell it how long to take, and you tell it what kind of easing to use. And there's this kind of this set number for durations that you have to declare ahead of time. And a lot of times you'll see, especially on Twitter and something, people who are I've decided that 0.15 seconds is the optimal duration for all UI animations. Therefore, all of my UI animations will be 0.15 seconds in duration. And if yours are any longer or shorter, you're wrong. Probably a few extra characters and you can fit on Twitter, but you get the point. People will focus on having this set duration as a solution to making all of their animations feel similar. But the problem is that when you have the same duration, having different movements can really affect the way that looks. One set duration might sound like a good idea, but there's so many ways that interface elements can animate. They can move very short distances, they can move long distances, they can have a very tiny fade in, they can have a massive, dramatic scale. All of those things need to have different durations or different timing to make sense. So when you match velocities, things will feel more related. So for example, this one, these two squares move different distances, so they have different durations, but they hit the same top speed. So we have short one and that one, and they're just both boom, boom. The other guy goes further, the bottom one goes further, but the top speed it hits is the same. You kind of get the sense this is the same square. And that's matching velocities. But if we go with the matching durations, things get a little bit weird. So if we have those same two squares but matched durations, they move very differently. The first one's and then the second one's yeah. They feel very different and have very different speeds. So matching the visual velocities instead of matching the durations will give you animations that feel more like they're coming from the same place, like they're related. The hard part is there's no really easy mathy way of matching duration or matching velocities. Most of the time it's more of an art than a science. You kind of have to just look at things and adjust as you go. So yeah, it takes a little bit more work, but the results are really great. One other thing to ask yourself about choreography when it comes to UI choreography is the idea of do you want to be cohesive or do you want to be consistent? We hear the phrase consistent choreography a lot, and it's kind of one of those things that you're well, wait, what does that really mean? And both of these are completely viable options you can use for your choreography. So an example of consistent choreography, really, really consistent choreography, is this Nixon Watches site. They have a lot of navigation, which they have a lot of animation on it, and every single animation is exactly the same. It's doop, doop, doop. They're all 0.2 seconds. They all have the exact same easing. They all move the exact same amount. They're super, super consistent. It's almost mechanical feeling, right? It's that consistent. And it works out super well for them because they make watches. Yeah, that one doesn't always work. Watches, consistent. Okay, never mind. We're we all just use our phones and our Apple Watches. Who needs gears in that? But it has that feel it totally fits what they make. It totally fits the mood of their design. That super, super consistent, always the same motion. On the other hand, there's also the idea of having things be more cohesive, and that's what an app more like Swarm does, where not all of the motion is exactly the same. They have very different motion depending on whether you're like going to a new place or showing you an ad or whatever else. But everything feels like it's kind of following that same rhythm and that same conductor. It all kind of has that sort of like feel to it where you're like, there's my modals going away. There's my thing loading up to show me I don't have enough badges because I don't check in enough. Like there's that similar feel to it, that similar rhythm, even though they're not exactly the same, and they still feel related. So if you're super interested in choreography and want to hear more about it, we did a whole episode on it on Motion and Meaning, where you can listen to us talk about it for an entire half an hour, about all the different ways choreography can affect your design and affect what you say. So that could be one way to find out more about that, and definitely give it some more thought as you're designing and building things. So choreography is thinking about animations as a group. We looked at like one animation very specifically, how to design it. We thought a little bit about how animations can behave in a group in a way that they might feel good together and might feel like they're related. But we can actually even take one more step back and kind of think about like what it is that we want this whole group of animations to say. Like, how are we going to express our actual brand, our actual product in motion? You know, we based our decisions on how our modal should move very much on the context of what was happening, but you can also base it on the bigger picture side, on what your brand wants to say about itself, how it wants to be perceived. A lot of the same things that Sarah and Dan were talking about yesterday, of like, what do you want to say? All of your design can be you know, kind of giving that same message. And just like you can choose type and color to say a specific thing, you can choose motion to say a specific thing. And when your type and color and motion are all saying the same thing, you get this really great, like, cohesive message and this really very strong message that can like kind of carry you across all contexts and have that similar feel. So sometimes there's certain brands I think come to mind a lot when it comes to brands in motion, especially online. You know, not too long ago, IBM released the machines in motion, where they were like, we're going to take all of these machines we used to make back when we made computers the size of this room, and we're going to create motion in our interface that mimics that motion of these physical objects. And this was like super great for IBM, and a really, really great connection of their history and what they do. But not all companies have this, like, used to have this huge history of making physical objects that they can pull from. Some definitely do, but not all of us are IBM in that sense. So another place you can look for how to inform your brand in motion is in things like voice and tone, things like the words you use to describe your brand. And it may seem a little bit crazy because you're like, voice and tone are for content. But content, you've written that voice and tone because you want your content to have a certain connotation. You want it to project a certain feel, a certain, you know, mood and all that kind of thing. And we can use those same descriptions, the same voice and tone, to base our motion in as well. So like you might describe your brand as things like, maybe we're energetic. You know, our modal was pretty energetic. Maybe we're really friendly. And like, friendly can look very different than energetic, right? Like, friendly can be kind of soft and squishy, and energetic might always be really like punchy. Who knows? There's different kinds of energetic. There's different kinds of friendly. Maybe your brand is very sleek, and that's going to look very different than friendly or energetic. Or maybe you're very strong or playful. Like, all of these words are words that brands might use to describe themselves. They're words you might find in your voice and tone describing the kind of copy and the kind of words you should use. And they're all things we can anchor our motion decisions off of to create these kind of like one central set of decisions that all of our motion should follow. So for example, we looked at follow through for our modal, and the inverse of that, when it comes to the classic principles, there's an inverse principle called anticipation. And both of those can create an energetic and friendly and bold feel. So like our little square here, he kind of like comes in, and then he bounces back out. And like depending on how drastic your sort of like overshoot is and how drastic your exit is, you can create a different sense of energy with those same two principles. Things like squash and stretch, which is another classic principle, can create a sense of really high energy and playfulness. Like a really basic squash and stretch looks like this, where our circle like stretches as it's moving very fast. So it's like moving so quickly, it stretches itself, and then it squishes together. And that kind of pliable nature of its, you know, that object can create that playful sense. When it's done a lot or done in a very exaggerated way, it can come off as very childish. When it's done more subtly, it can come off as very playful and, you know, very high energy because it's, you know, has so much energy, it's changing shape. Oh my goodness. So squash and stretch can get us those. When it comes to ease in outs, you know, we can create a sense of a more balanced and measured motion. So like contrast this little box with the way the follow-through one moved. You know, the one with follow-through was like, here I am, and then it went to leave, and it was like, I'm going, and this one's just like, this is where I'm supposed to be. Now I will leave. Like, it knows exactly where it's going. It doesn't have to like change course and be like, whoa. It's just like very decided, very smooth, and very natural too, because that ease in out movement is exactly how basically everything in nature works. You kind of speed up, and then you slow down before you stop. And that ease in out is not necessarily just like the keyword ease in out. It's basically any type of easing that starts slow, goes fast, and then slows down at the end as well. Kind of following on that calmer, slower sense, you know, smaller movements can feel more calm and subtle. So our modal suggested that it came from like below the screen. But we started its motion only 400 pixels below where it would normally be, right? So it wasn't starting from the bottom, it was starting from like here. But the fact that we kind of faded it in and had that upward motion, we created that illusion that it came all the way from the bottom, even though it technically really didn't. And you can do that with even smaller movements too, and create that sense of like something entering from the side, even if it just makes a very small movement, because you just reference that idea. So these smaller movements can still feel like things have come from the bottom or give a sense from where it came from, even though it only moves a very little bit. And that small motion feels very different than like that big motion that comes up. Has a different feel and a different mood to it. Going even softer, we can actually create animation with no motion in it at all. We can animate things that have no change in position, like blurs, opacity. All of those things can create a very soft and stable sense because nothing is moving, but they're just kind of like appearing. And there's a lot you can do with creating depth with opacity and blurs too. So like you can make things go very far forward as opposed to very far up and down. So when we have these things kind of like blur in softly and like blur out, it's very stable and can be very, very soft too. So using animation doesn't necessarily always have to be super high energy. It can also be very calm and settling and that kind of thing. So there's a whole spectrum that we can create, a spectrum of moods and references we can create with motion. And it's really just a sense of deciding what makes the most sense for you and your brand and what its message and personality is and matching those up so that everything is saying the same thing. You might have guessed that this is where this is all going, especially after a couple of talks yesterday. But these details about animation, documentation around the decisions you make or the intentions you have behind animation should totally be part of your design system or your style guide, or however it is you create that kind of global sense of what your brand or your app is. Like, we took a lot of time to think about our modal and how it should move and why it should move the way it did, but you don't need to do that every single time you have a modal. Once you've made that decision once, if you write it down somewhere, document it somewhere, the next time you, future you, or some other person entirely can go and look at that documentation and make a modal that is just as well thought out, basically just by following those directions and not having to give it all that time or thought too. So it's always nice when you can save future you some time. So some things you might want to document. And we looked at this a little bit, even with just our modal of like, documenting what it is that we use our animation for. For that modal, we use it for an entrance. And there's a number of things you can use animation for, a number of purposes it can have. You don't have to use 50 of them. You could have just one or two, and that could be your thing. Like, we only animate things as they enter the screen. You're going to have a very distinct style by making that decision and sticking to it. We can use animation to transition between states, to tell stories, to give this a sense of personality. And orientation is another big one too, of like, we often only show a very small amount of our interface on screen, and there's things kind of like off and around. And using motion, we can give a sense of where those things came from and why they were there. So the Lightning Design System, which was referenced, I think, at least once or twice yesterday, does this for their motion guidelines as well, where they're like, here are the 4 things we use animation for. And if you were like a Salesforce developer and you want to go make an app and you want to add some animation, it better fit in one of those 4 categories to be true to their system and their style guide. A client of mine I was working with earlier this year, we decided that these were the 4 things they used animation for. They wanted to use animation for feedback, emphasis, spatial orientation, and to like kind of tell stories in the empty states of their app. And those were the 4 things they were going to use animation for, and basically they wouldn't use it for anything else. Or if someone wanted to add animation, it should fit into one of those 4 categories. So it's a really good way to have a focused approach to motion and create that very like distinct statement and point of view. Documenting your building blocks is also super helpful. It kind of goes down a little bit less big picture, but documenting how it is you do your durations and ranges and rhythms, like how long should things take? There's no one right answer to how fast an animation should be. There's a certain range that will work out perfectly well, but maybe you want to keep all of yours on the very short side of the range. Maybe you want to have 3 or 4 durations people can use. Whatever will make the most sense. You want to create these like smart defaults. So anyone who's like, I don't know how animation works, but I need to make a thing move, they can just be like, oh cool, it says I should use this duration, it says I should use this easing, put them together, great animation. And everyone can make these good decisions really quickly. You definitely want to document things like the easings that you use. I think at a minimum, every place should kind of create your own custom ease in and ease out. Even just that alone, using those over the default keywords will give your entire site or your entire application a different feel. And of course, the idea of the physical space and like once you are animating between layers, you probably want to know like how far is the overlay from the modal. Are they this far apart? Are they this far apart? You know, it makes a big difference in how you make things move. So this is IBM this is kind of their building blocks. Their building blocks are very much kind of educational, saying like, we animate rotation, and this is how we do it, and here's what it should look like. You know, they were based on their audience, they were very focused on educating around animation as opposed to just saying, use these things. So they kind of gave that extra depth. This is one that I came up with a client of mine where we were like, we're going to create these named animations. We have our fade in, it only handles opacity. We have our scale in, here's the properties it touches, and kind of created this this sort of palette or the set of animations that were the go-to of like, if you need to scale stuff in, this is the thing you use. And we even went so far as to create an easing palette to use, which gave us like a certain number of easings, all these custom cubic Beziers, based on the kinds of things we wanted to say. So if you wanted to create motion that was very stable, you would use the ease in or the ease outs. If you needed to like just kind of get a little punch of energy and make things stand out, and we had the overshoot and anticipate. So this was kind of like a short list, like an easing palette essentially, and you can use that to create contrast and to create, you know, harmony in the same way you would use a palette of a color palette or type too. So the end goal here is really to create kind of like your own animation library, and whether that can mean whatever it means to you. It can be like a documented set of like, here's the easings we use, here's the durations we use, or it could be something as elaborate as like a public style guide. You know, anything that kind of saves and documents some of those decisions so you don't have to make them like a second, third, or fourth time, and that you have this sort of guiding way to make all of your animations have like a consistent feel and feel like they're coming from the same place. Any way you can do that is going to be super helpful for working with motion as you go forward. So those are all ways we can make motion a little bit, you know, make some better decisions around motion and make it something that is just as thought out and just as designed as our color choices or our type choices. Like, make it truly part of the whole design overall. But one last thing I want to talk to you about is the idea of finding inspiration for motion. You know, one of the big things that makes motion so hard for us as web designers is we really don't have much background in it. You know, we're pretty good at finding like galleries of like beautiful type or like beautiful color palettes, but we don't always know where to go to find good animation. And the more you kind of expose yourself to good animation and also like look at animation and decide what it is to you that makes it good, the better decisions you can make about animation in your own work. So I have 3 favorite places to look for really great animation inspiration. The first is Art of the Title, which is a whole site dedicated to title sequences for movies and TV. They also tend to interview the designers behind it and talk about why they did the things they did. And I find this one to be particularly interesting because even though their end format is very different from what we make, like they make videos and stuff, they're often coming from the same place where they're like, we had a story to tell, we had a message, and we had type and color, and we put them together in this title animation. So it's really interesting to see how they come up with those things. And then also, there's just some really amazing title design. Another great place is Captivate.co. There's 2 Ps, that's super annoying, but this gallery is great. She puts together, the thing I really like about this one is instead of showing just like, here's one cool animation from Dribbble, here's one cool animation from another app, she pulls multiple animations from one app. So like this little screenshot here shows you like 3 things from the Flickr app. So you can get a better sense of like, how do these animations play well together? Are these animations I want to use? You know, it's very different looking at these as a group than it is just seeing like something that looks beautiful on Dribbble. I think you can gain a lot more from looking closely at these and thinking like, is this something I'd want to use? Is this something I would want to make, and how they go together? And then one that is much more web focused is user interface, or UYI.io. That's also hard to say. We need to work on these URLs. But this one is pulls from mostly all web sources. And the really great thing about this one is they put them in categories. So like you can go in and be like, let me see how like this one here is drag. Like, let me see all the ways people have animated drag and drop. It's really great for if you're kind of stuck for like, I feel like motion should happen here. I don't really know what it should do. You can go to user interface and see like 50 examples of how someone else did it to maybe like spur that thought process and get you away from like the blank page of like, oh no, what do I do? So that one's really great for that. So I think the more we can expose ourselves to good animation and generally just have opinions on the animation that you see and what you think is good, the better the animation in your work, the better you'll do at creating animation in your work. So, yeah, thanks so much for talking animation with me. As Jeffrey mentioned, I have a book called Designing Interface Animation. It is approximately half the height of a small terrier. She hasn't, I mean, that's my dog. She hasn't really said anything about what she thinks of the book yet. Yeah. Anyways, you can get it for 20% off with the coupon code here, AEA Orlando. And if you enjoyed this talk, if this is the kind of thing you're interested in, this book dives into it even more. So thanks so much for hanging out with me and talking animation today. I would love to talk about it more in the next day or so. I will be here and happy to discuss animation at any point in time. So thanks so much.